Now, it does me great pleasure to provide a formal introduction to today's guest co-host, Cindu Thomas George. And as I normally do, I want to give her a very official and formal introduction, and then we'll bring her on so that she can greet the audience in her own way. Cindu Thomas George is the founder and principal trainer of Shakti Diversity and Equity Training. As a DEI practitioner, she designs and facilitates professional development experiences that promote equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and intercultural competence. As a nationally recognized speaker, Cindu's speaking engagements are focused on encouraging cross-racial allyship, disrupting anti-Asian hate, moving beyond color blindness to color consciousness, disrupting anti-Blackness in communities of color, and creating inclusion for women of color in the workplace. Cindu is also an award-winning tenured professor of communication studies at the College of Lake County, specializing in intercultural communication and public speaking. In her 17 years of working as a diversity educator, she has developed a mastery of creating and facilitating impactful learning experiences that equip individuals with the knowledge and skills necessary to be advocates of diversity and agents of change. And equipped and agents of change who are empowered to work towards cultivating an inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist society. I lost my place for a second. Cindu is also committed to cultivating inclusivity and anti-racism within her own South Indian American community, and is co-founder of Malayalis for Black Lives Matter and Malayalis for Social Justice. And so in your own way, VodCast community, please, either through some emojis or some very positive affirmations into the chat, let's welcome today our very special guest, Cindu Thomas George. It's such a treat to have you here. I'm so grateful that you said yes. What would you like to share with this community just to let us know a little bit more about you that we would not be able to find in your bio?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining this conversation. I guess a few things that you wouldn't know about me from my bio is I'm a mom. That's my most important role. I have 7- and 10-year-old boys. I'm a Malayali American. As Nika was saying, I helped to co-found a couple of different organizations within my own Indian community. And my parents and ancestors are from Kerala, India, which is one of the most southern states in India, on the coast of India. And I'm very proud and connected to my Indian roots. I guess other than that, I'm a first-generation college student. I'm the second woman in my extended family to attend and graduate college. And some fun facts. I love fitness. I'm really into nature. So I enjoy camping and hiking, and I'm an urban dweller. I really need to live in cities and be around a lot of diversity and just excitement. So that's a little bit about myself that you wouldn't read about.
No, that is fantastic. It always helps us to have a deeper level of understanding of maybe the experiences and the lens that our guest co-hosts bring to this conversation. So thank you for taking the time to share. And although you really enjoy the urban aspect of living, we did have a chance to talk briefly while we were waiting to start the podcast today. You shared that you were in South Carolina recently and in Charleston, and that you enjoyed it. And so we're so glad that you were able to experience South Carolina.
I love living in cities and vacationing not in cities.
No, absolutely. Okay, so I want to just take a moment before we really delve into disrupting anti-Blackness, which I know is a really important topic that you have a lot of passion for, and it finds its way into many of your talks. I want to define that for this audience. And so can you provide some perspective for us around anti-Blackness? And then I want you to explain, what does it mean to disrupt anti-Blackness, and how does it present itself in the workplace?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to do that. Well, first, I think it's important to be clear that as a South Asian person, I speak about this topic from a place of racial privilege, right? I think the goal in talking about this topic is to encourage people who are not Black to engage in cross-racial allyship so that we can help eradicate the centuries of oppression, injustice, and inequalities that Black Americans have experienced. And so, in talking about this, I just want to acknowledge my privilege. And so I would define anti-Blackness as being the covert and overt, both systemic and interpersonal racism against Black people. And anti-Blackness is really a form of discrimination that has negatively impacted the health, including mental health, the wealth, and then the safety of Black Americans in this country. And this has been happening since the early 1600s, and it continues to persist today. So that's a little bit of how I would describe anti-Blackness. And I think one of the things about anti-Blackness that we are not aware of as a society is that, since the murder of George Floyd, a lot of people are dialed into this topic, right? And it seems like a lot of people have fallen off the interest, but for at least a year, there was so much engagement. And I think a lot of people think that anti-Blackness just, became a thing after Trayvon Martin was murdered, right? But we know that that's not the case, right? Anti-Blackness has been in this country since the inception of this country, since before, since starting in 1619. And it shows up in so many different ways, right? From medical racism to having the cops called on you for bird watching, to being gunned down while you're taking a jog in, a neighborhood, to police brutality, to being labeled angry, and unprofessional when you're just passionately talking in work, to, being labeled unprofessional because of the hairstyle that you're wearing, to being mistaken for the custodian when you're the owner or the manager, right? These are all examples of anti-Blackness. So it's so pervasive in our society that it's almost subconscious. And that's kind of how I would say that. And then what did you wanted me to talk about how to disrupt it or how it shows?
Yeah. So just, how does it present itself in the workplace? And some of those examples that you just articulated certainly helps us to get a better picture of it. But I love how you categorized it as it's where, you said health, wealth, and safety. And I placed that into the chat because I love that. That's a great way to summarize those three main significant areas of impact. And as we begin to unpack those three areas, there's so much more to be said. Yeah. And so do you have other specific examples as to how maybe it shows forth in the workplace specifically?
Sure. So, I don't have the numbers or the data, but if you look as a DI practitioner, I work across different industries and I look at the demographics, who's being represented, who's in leadership, and Black people are always underrepresented, right?
Right.
DEI initiatives have really worked for the benefit of women, but specifically white women, right? And so Black women are being left behind, women of color, Black men. And so Black people are always really not moving forward with these initiatives, and they're underrepresented, especially in leadership roles. And it's because of anti-Blackness, right? And one thing I think that we have to realize is that anti-Blackness is subconscious. And anti-Blackness thrives because of white supremacy, right? Anti-Blackness and white supremacy are interconnected and they're dependent on each other. They need each other to survive. And the only way to stop anti-Blackness is to help dismantle the system of white supremacy. And our workplaces are so entrenched in white Eurocentric norms. And so just, I think that as a product of the culture of our workplaces, it is, inherently anti-Black. So I think that's important to acknowledge, at least in my work, in my opinion. But a couple of different examples of anti-Blackness is, from the more covert form of microaggressions, like, oh, you speak really well and articulate, or you're really pretty, or oh wow, I was surprised that you went to Yale. These are all things that people told me in my work. So those are little microaggressions, unchecked anti-Black biases that all of us have, right? Even Black people have anti-Black bias.
Right.
And so, having those, over and over again is just, exhausting. Being, told that you're not professional or you're not intelligent because you speak in a different vernacular of English. So African-American vernacular English is a rule-governed, vernacular of English, but and oftentimes, white people or non-Black people can use it and they're not criticized. But when Black people use it, it's not okay.
Right.
Being overlooked for promotions. I was just in a meeting yesterday with a bunch of Black women from my workplace. And, there was a couple of women that are seasoned professors and they keep getting overlooked, for tenure, for promotions, while other people much less senior than them are getting, the jobs. And this is something that one of the women said, this is something my mom dealt with, right? And the woman that I'm talking about is probably in her early 60s, so nothing is really changing. being told your hair is unprofessional. I mean, literally, California had to put in a
Right.
law against hair discrimination because it's such a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being, I think I said being labeled aggressive and angry or unprofessional because you're passionate. I've also experienced that, even though I'm not Black. And then really just being reprimanded because you're not adhering to white Eurocentric norms of the workplace.
Right.
Those are all some examples at the top of my head.
Yeah, those are perfect examples, real examples. And I love bringing practicality to these conversations because sometimes, again, as we talk about issues of equity and inclusion, it can feel somewhat nebulous. And so I always love making sure that we can provide some examples. And you certainly gave us some really good ones. So yeah, go for it.
I forgot one big one. And I think this is not just true for Black people, but lots of people of color in the workplace, is having your credibility and your intellect questioned just for no other reason.
Yeah.
You don't fit the standard, or you don't, fit the stereotypes of what it looks like to be a professor or a doctor or whatever. So extra unnecessary questioning and, yeah.
Yeah, that is huge. You actually triggered something for me when you gave that last example, and I will share transparently that one example that comes to mind specifically is that as a practitioner in this space that has spent a lot of time really learning and still so much to learn. I had a client once that once we delivered the assessment report, they questioned all of the data. So first and foremost, I'm really big on, if you're going to hire someone to do an assessment for you, be willing to believe the data, right? Be willing to believe the data. The data is the data. But there was so much trepidation with really wanting to receive and believe the data that they wanted to take the data that we collected and give it to another entity to verify. Wow. And did not even realize in the moment how insulting that was, how unprofessional that was, and again, how anti-Black that was.
And that wouldn't have happened if you were a white man.
No, oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So I appreciate the clarity in which these examples are probably helping some people in our audience to understand really the depths and the harm that that anti-Blackness creates for so many. So how can someone of color use their racial privilege to be an ally in eradicating anti-Blackness? Because you mentioned, and I was nodding my head in great level of affirmation, because yes, this is not something that happens only where white people or non-Black people or non-people of color certainly can engage in subconsciously some levels of anti-Blackness. And so talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, I think one of the unfortunate things is a lot of people of color think that they can't be anti-Black, right? Because they've experienced racism themselves. And, being a non-Black person of color, I've heard this several times. I've heard it in my own communities, in my own families. And the reality is that all of us have the capability to be anti-Black, and all of us to some level are subconsciously anti-Black, because anti-Black has been embedded into anti-Blackness has been embedded into the DNA of the United States, right? So we're subconsciously ingesting anti-Black messages and not even realizing it. I think that's the biggest struggle. And so as a person of color, it's so important to look in the mirror, right? And to really unpack and unlearn your anti-Blackness. But before you do that, you first have to face that you probably are anti-Black. Mm-hmm. And do like an inventory of different things to just to see some examples of how you might be anti-Black. So I think that's one of the things, is that and also I'll realize that as a non-Black person of color, you sit at a place of racial privilege, and I explained that in the beginning of my talk with you, because I do think it's important to always recognize and acknowledge your privilege. And we have a racial hierarchy in this society. And, the facts are Black people are at the bottom of this racial hierarchy. And there are different communities of color. And I hate to have these labels, but it's just the reality. In South Asia, like myself, I would say we're pretty well under just white people. We're under white people a lot of ways. Asian, if you just look at the demographic information, if you look at the economic information, South Asian folks have the highest household median income. They have one of the highest education, academic achievement rates. And I'm not trying to perpetuate model minorities, because there's a huge disparity. But if you just look at the facts, you can't deny that. And so we have a responsibility to use our privilege, right?
Yes.
To help ensure that racial equality exists. I think that people of color need to disrupt the cycle of anti-Blackness, and really realize how they are complicit in upholding the system and culture of white supremacy as well.
Yeah.
So just the connections of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, I think a lot of people don't make, but they're so interconnected. And, you know, a lot of people of color don't feel personally committed or responsible to dismantle anti-Black racism. But I think that it's so important for us as people of color to realize that as a person of color, you are also subject to the violence and the oppression of white supremacy, right?
Right.
White supremacy negatively impacts all communities of color, not just Black folks, right? So we all have, you know, a benefit in working collectively to dismantle the system of white supremacy and anti-Black racism. And then I think it's also important to unlearn some of the anti-Black sentiments that we've learned throughout our lives.
Yes.
And Ibram Kendi, in his How to Be Anti-Racism book, that's, you know, probably everybody knows about that book. He actually, I admire him because he talks about something that most people don't talk about, and that is ethnic racism, right? He actually acknowledges that, don't tell me that it's just white people that can be racist against others, right? There's ethnic racism. We have interracial conflict between us, amongst us, and it's so important to remember that. And I think also it's important to find the courage to address anti-Black racism within your own communities, within your own families, educate your families, your friends about anti-Blackness, and call out anti-Black comments and thinking and behaviors when you hear it or see it, right? Because it really starts at home. I was just texting with someone this morning, who will remain nameless, and the person is a South Asian person, and they use the N-word in just like a, you know, a fun way. And I was like, you cannot, don't ever text that to me again. You know, like I could choose to ignore it, right? But so many people do, and that's a form of anti-Blackness, right? Using the N-word. Words don't belong to everyone, right? So even something like that is not intentionally anti-Black, I think it's so important to disrupt when you have the awareness of that. And yeah, I think that's one. And then another thing that we can do is really avoid white adjacency and white centering, right? A lot of color, even Black folks, right, are white adjacent and white centering. And I want to say that, you know, I don't want to hate on people who are white adjacent, because at some point in our country, it was a necessity, right, to survive. Survival technique. My parents were white adjacent in the 70s when they came here, right? Because there wasn't a lot of other people of color and they wanted to thrive and survive. And so they had to assimilate, right? But now, as we become increasingly diverse as a country, and we have more Black folks, more Asian folks, more Latino folks than ever, you know, we have no reason to be white centering, because at some point we are going to be the majority, right? So, don't adhere to white dominant norms. I did this, you know, my personal story is one that, you know, I had lots of identity issues because I grew up in an all white community, and I was, you know, experienced terrible racism and xenophobia from the age of 5. You know, when I grew up in the 80s, dot head and Hindu were derogatory terms for brown folks like me. And my name just happens to rhyme with Hindu. So Cindu the Hindu was kind of, it stuck, right? And I was called that. I was, you know, people used to throw rocks at me and spit in my face, and things like teachers never stopped and disrupted. And I learned to feel ashamed of who I was, right? And so because I was centered in whiteness, I started to ingest this white is right mentality. And I didn't even realize I was doing it. And I'm not blaming my younger self. That's something, it was a survival technique, right? So I changed my name to Cindy. I said I was from Malaysia. I was a kid. I didn't know any better. And then I kept that through my adolescence. And it wasn't until I started to learn about critical race theory and whiteness theory and post-colonial studies that was transformative for me, right? And so that's kind of why I went into higher ed, because I learned to decolonize my mind through education, but not everybody has that opportunity, right? And so adhering to white dominant norms is something that a lot of us do subconsciously. You know, the way you talk, the way you wear your hair, changing your name to anglicize it, distancing yourself from Black people so that you can be perceived to be more likable or professional or acceptable. Those are all examples of white centering toning down racial issues, right? Or not calling out white supremacy when you should, because you want to avoid making white folks feel uncomfortable. See, those are all examples of just from my life that I've been told by many people, you should maybe not talk about race so much. Like a decade ago, somebody told me that, you're obsessed with race. Why do you always talk about racism? And it's because it's there, right? And so we worry about, well, what are the people in our community going to think if we're calling out white supremacy? And I think that we should not worry about white feelings over the health, wealth, and safety of Black people, right? So so these are all different examples of white adjacency. And I think that it's important for people of color to realize that we are white adjacent. A lot of us are. I know people in my life that are still white adjacent. And the thing is, they're not even aware of that, right? And it's contextual. If you are growing up and you're in a white community, it's something that you're not even aware of. And it just takes a little bit of self-reflection and awareness. So I encourage everyone who's listening to think about how you might be white centering and white adjacency. I think another problem and another thing that people of color can do is reject the colorblind ideology, right? Colorblindness is an ideology that so many Americans hold on to, and not to our fault. And it's not just white people who say, I don't see race, I don't see color, we should all be the same. People of color do too, because Ronald Reagan introduced this ideology in the 80s, right? And it's been reintroduced and strengthened by politicians, by church leaders. And so I have a talk around going beyond colorblind to color conscious. And, so many people that I work with are like, I can't believe that you're supposed to be able to say, I see color, right? Because they've been taught that not seeing color is polite, right? But when we insist that we don't see color, or someone's skin color, and that we're all the same, we're really allowing for racism to persist and thrive, right? And colorblindness results in racism without racists. And that's the name of a book that I just read by Edward Bonilla Silva, or Edward Silva Bonilla, I forget. He's a Puerto Rican African-American sociologist. I recommend the book, Racism Without Racists. But that's what happens when we insist that we live in a colorblind ideology. There is no racism because you can't see race, right?
Right.
And I can keep going, but I'll stop right there.
No.
I have a couple more.
No, well, a couple more may be useful, because I'll tell you, I'm watching the chat and people are really engaged in all that you're sharing. And I think that folks are really curious about understanding more what white adjacency is, and white centering and white dominance. And so with the examples that you started to give, I think that is helping to provide some deepened clarity. So why don't you kind of stay in that path for just another moment or two?
A couple of other things is, people of color, just like white people in this country, we want to hold on to this myth of meritocracy, right? If you work hard, you will achieve. And I think in the work that I've done in the last 17 years, one of the biggest kind of takeaways is people don't know history, right? And so they don't understand the system of racism. And because of that, we insist on the myth of meritocracy, especially immigrants, right? So the idea if, well, I came to this country with $5 and no English 25 years ago. And if I can make it, then Black people can make it because they've been here since the 1600s. I mean, literally, I've heard this so many times in different contexts, not just in Indian communities and workplaces, people of different, people from all over the world that have immigrated here. And that is such a narrow-minded thought process, because the reason why we have achieved and succeeded as non-Black people of color is because of the fight and the struggle for racial equality that were led, for centuries by Black Americans. And so, that mentality of if I can do it, they can do it, that's anti-Black, right? The myth of meritocracy is anti-Black, because it's just really not thinking about the struggle, right? The systemic discrimination and racism that was really built into this country. And it also is not, paying homage. I think that a lot of communities of color and people of color don't realize how much we owe Black people. And to be honest with you, outside of my own personal racist experiences and just being super sensitive to racism, one of the reasons I'm so laser focused on disrupting anti-Blackness is because I am so grateful. I also think that my family wouldn't be where we are without, the struggle and without Black folks. And then I guess I have maybe one or two other things. One is people of color can be pro-Black, not just anti-racist, but pro-Black. I think
Yeah.
we need to shift from this, I'm an anti-racist, because anyone can say they're anti-racist, right? But unless Black people are free, nobody is free, right? So I think that we have to shift that conversation to really being pro-Black. You know, what does it mean to be pro-Black, and talking about that and being pro-Black, and, you know, doing little things like when an election season comes up for your local politicians, vote for politicians that are pro-Black, people that are talking about what they are going to do for the Black community, support organizations that are working to change anti-Black laws and policies, right? Because the whole goal of activism is policy change. And, you know, marching in the streets and all of that is important, posting on Facebook or whatever, great, but nothing is going to change unless policy, right? So yeah, so
absolutely.
Sorry, I'm sure I have more, but those are just some of them.
No, that's great. That is great. That is great. So I want to talk about the use of the word minority. I know that you have a pretty visceral reaction to the use of that word, and you've been an advocate for not using the word minority. So tell us more behind the idea of that and what alternatives that you like to subscribe to.
Yeah. So I think one, you know, the language of diversity and inclusion is always evolving. So,
yes,
you know, people of color, color people was, you know, polite at one point, right? And then it went to people of color, and now it's Black, Indigenous people of color. And similar to that, we use words, and then, you know, we think that we don't really kind of understand the meaning behind them. And the word minority, I encourage people to stop using when you're referring to women and people of color. One, because the word minority could connotate a value judgment of less than. So literally minor, according to the Oxford Dictionary, I think it means like below or lesser of importance, seriousness or significance, right? That's literally the definition from Oxford Dictionary. And we never want to say that anyone is lesser in importance, seriousness, or significance. And so in general, we should stay away from minority. And the reality is that we use minority all the time to talk about women. Women are actually the majority in this country, the numerical majority. They are 51% of the population. Additionally, people of color will soon be the majority of the population, not the minority, right? And so I think the most recent census, the biggest finding was people who identify as biracial or multiracial has increased like something ridiculous. Right. It went from 9 million in 2000 to 36 million in 2010, 9 million, 2020, 36 million. So now you have so many people that are biracial, and those people might identify with, you know, their ethnic or racial identity that's not white, right? And so the reality why we should say stay away from it is because, well, people of color and women are really not the minorities, and people who are minoritized endure mistreatment, they're pushed to the margins, and they face prejudices and forced upon them because of situations outside of their control, right? And so I always advocate for minoritized. It's a hard shift if you say minority, but another thing is if you look at government publications, education, if you listen to, you know, the news, people are still saying minority. And so it's hard to kind of unlearn, but we can be the, you know, the shift changers.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your perspective on that. And there is certainly something to be said for how do we then evolve the language and bring others along? Because I do think that words matter, language matters, and we certainly want to be careful about that.
And Nika, I have a YouTube video. I don't know if you can link this when you post this, but I do have a YouTube video that goes into the word and the reasons around minoritized.
No, that's great. So my colleagues are actually going to try to source that, and we'll make sure we place it into the chat and as well as into the follow-up email that will be sent to all of our VodCast community members. And so thank you, Cindu. So I want to talk about your work as in higher education. And I specifically want to find or have you just to describe what were some of the challenges entering higher education within your field. And it's particularly as you bring your voice and your perspective around anti-Blackness, and what are some moments maybe that have been surprising to you, either with your students or your peers, others in that higher learning institution environment?
Yeah, well, you know, one of the reasons I got into this work is because of my personal lived experiences of being on the wrong side of inclusion, right? So I've experienced more exclusion than inclusion from my childhood. my adolescence. And, I told you a little bit about being empowered through whiteness theory and critical race studies. And
Yeah.
for a few years, not like 2 or 3 years, I felt like free, right? I found myself, I decolonized my mind. I was going to change the world. And then at the age of 25, I started teaching in higher education full time, right? I was an adjunct for 5 years, and then I became full time and tenured a few years after that. And, I had a few years of not experiencing oppressive situations. And then I went into higher ed, being a young woman of color. In higher ed is entrenched in elitism, and it is overrepresented by males. And 17 years ago, overrepresented by white males specifically. So I would say a lot of the reason I do what I do is because of the challenges I've experienced. I've written about this, but I'll just, the first year that I taught in higher education, I was assigned to share an office, right? It was a cubicle, but a desk with a white male adjunct who is probably in his late 50s. And he had never had to share a desk, right? And here I am, this 25-year-old woman of color, and he refused to share space with me. I mean, literally, I would bring a book, I would bring a picture frame, and I would come back the next day and would be on the floor of our office. And he also would write me racist notes. And then he would also talk about me, loudly to other people, or just, complain about me where we were in a cubicle. So other faculty were hearing, and I was new. And so people would come and write me notes and say, Cindu, I'm really sorry to say this, but you should know this. And the dean got involved and said, hey, you have to stop doing this. You need to share space with her. You need to stop writing her, notes like this. And he refused to do it. So we had to get the union involved. So here I am, my first year being an adjunct at City College of San Francisco, excited for my career. And I'm like being told non-verbally, you don't belong here, right? And so I think, that's just one experience. I can write a book, but that's, a challenge has been just in general, ageism, sexism, racism, elitism. I didn't go to an Ivy League college. I went to Western Illinois University, and I'm proud of it. I'm a first generation college student. My parents told me to go wherever my brother went. And I think that I'm proof that you don't need, and I went to San Francisco State for my graduate program, and I studied under an amazing professor that really trained me. And I think you don't need to go through Ivy League colleges to be smart and to be credible. And I think that's hard because I have to always kind of prove myself, especially being a professor. People are all like, where did you go? I didn't go to Yale. I didn't go to Harvard. And I'm proud of that, because I think that you don't have to, go to these schools, but, dealing with that elitism has been challenging. People questioning my credibility, my experience, my ability, because I don't fit, or I didn't fit the role of what a professor looked like. So I would have students, even question me. And, English was not my first language, even though, soon after it was, but my parents, they spoke, our Malayalam, which is our language. And even though they speak English, they don't speak it, they're not native English speakers, right? So I was taught to say words that probably weren't pronounced the right way. And I would, once in a while, I would mispronounce a word. And I remember I had a student that stopped the class. He was an older white male student and said, I can't believe you're teaching, they let you teach communication when you can't even teach English. Right. So these kind of things. And I wonder if, if I was a white male and I mispronounced the word, if that would have been said. I mean, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been. Right. So it's kind of those things that I've had to experience. Another thing is being expected to engage in free labor and volunteer my time. I'm really a big advocate for diversity and inclusion at all the institutions that I've ever worked in, especially the one that I work at now. And I think there's this idea that, and it's not just me, it's all women of all people. Right. But you're Indian or you're Black and you care about this. So lead it, right? And we're not going to give you release time. And I experienced that when I first started working, and I didn't even realize that I could get release time. I was, running the diversity council at my college, and it might have been an oversight, but, I was struggling for years trying to balance everything. And that taught me a really big lesson of I'm not engaging in free labor, right? And it shouldn't just be people of color that are expected to do the work of DEI. It should be everyone, including white folks, right? So those are some of the challenges that I've experienced. What was the second question that you had asked?
They were intertwined. It really was about, your challenges in higher ed, and then also what were some moments that surprised you? And if the examples that you gave were not surprising to you and very jarring, I don't know what could be. So I feel like you captured both of those, but if there's something else that's coming up for you, certainly share.
Surprising, I think I don't know if you're talking about surprising in my work with anti-Blackness or just surprising in general. And I think these are both intertwined for me. But one of the surprising things I think of just kind of the pushback I get, racism in our country, the conversation of racism is really, really binary. It's black and white, right? And I'm not black or white, I'm brown, right? But I give a crap. Like I care about, disrupting racism and white supremacy. And sometimes because I don't fit neatly into that box of black and white, I get resistance from both white and black folks, right? And that surprises me. I think that, recently I've experienced more questioning from black folks than I ever have. And that's because I've come out more strongly around, conversing around anti-Blackness and doing trainings in the workplace and, offering sessions for clients about how to disrupt anti-Blackness in the workplace. And I think people see that and they're critical, right? They're like, well, why do you care? Right. And I was interviewed by a woman who had Radically Blindian, Keisha Matthews. She has a YouTube channel. She's married to an Indian man. She's a Black woman. And she really looks at anti-Blackness in every context, but especially South Asian. She interviewed me. And she said something that was really profound, and it made me kind of have some clarity on why I get pushback. She's like, I've been following you for a few years and I don't get it. Like, I'm just enamored that you're not married to a Black person. You don't have Black children. You have no one Black in your family. You didn't grow up with Black people. You didn't grow up in a Black community, but you care so much about Black people. Why? Right. And that made me think like, that's probably what people are wondering. Like they probably think I have some agenda up my sleeve. And that's maybe why I get pushback and resistance. I don't know. I think a lot of people are territorial as well. And Nika, I think you talked about this in one of your former podcasts about, or VodCast about like, who can speak on racism, who has the, ability, the authority, and the right to talk about racism, anti-Black racism. And I think that in a multiracial society, racial justice has to be a multiracial effort, right? And everyone has a place in this fight, and we need as many people as we can get. And so the idea that like, well, you're not dark enough, or you're not Black, or, I've literally been in conference sessions where Black folks have been arguing with each other about racial privilege. So I'm dark skinned and I should be profiting from this, not you. Like literally someone telling a light skinned Black person that they shouldn't be doing anti-racism work. And I find that conversation so odd. I don't understand it. But I think it's something that happens a lot. And I'm sure you see it on social media. I've seen it.
Absolutely.
I just think, and I get caught up in that, right? I'm not a Black person. I'm an Indian person. So if a Black person thinks that a white skinned Black person shouldn't be doing this work, what do they think of me, right? So that's been a little surprising.
No, thank you for sharing that. And one of the things that I really value about this podcast community is that we can bring up these hard topics that are not always discussed. But yeah, you're right. Those are sentiments that I have heard as well. And I think that's the value of perspective and giving people enough information to whet their appetite so they can continue to kind of explore for themselves as well. So thank you. And I do believe that we need everyone in this fight so that we all can emerge stronger. And I appreciate the work that you do. So I have one more question, really actually more questions, but I'm going to do one more question and then I'm going to turn it over because I'm seeing the chat and there's questions that are coming through and I want to be able to open the floor up to center voices of others. And so prepare in just a moment to unmute yourself and share. And if you do not want to share directly, you can certainly place it into the chat and we will bring your voice to the conversation. So here's my question. How do you feel someone of color can unintentionally make conversations more difficult around anti-Blackness? And what are some key practices to avoid in that perspective?
Ooh, well, I think that we have to realize that there are people of color who are just explicitly anti-Black, right? And I can just throw out some famous names like Candace Owens or Ben Carson or Bobby Jindal, right? These are people who are not working to advance Black people. when we have Black, Indigenous, people of color, public figures who are spewing anti-Blackness, it just makes it more pervasive and strengthens the narrative. So I think that's one way, and it's, it creates a difficult conversation because within the community, because you can be a brown or Black person and say, well, that person is anti-Black, so I'm going to ingest that and I'm going to, reiterate that. So I think that's one of them. I think hiding I talked about the N-word. And I think when you're an ally and you're an advocate and you're trying to, be down with, Black folks and get to know them, and then you start appropriating culture, that can make it really complicated and difficult. So like, you might have a Black friend that says it's okay, you can use the N-word, but there's 40 million Black Americans in this country. And just because your one Black friend says it's okay, doesn't mean it's okay, right? And I think that sometimes I've heard people try to be friendly and try to kind of be down with Black folks, and they use the N-word in a friendly way and not realize that just complicates the situation. Also, wearing your hair in certain hairstyles like box braids or, different styles that you might think it's beautiful. But, if you're not a Black person and you're wearing box braids, you're not going to get the same crap in the workplace or in any professional situation as a Black person. And so doing these things, like a lot of, the whole conversation on cultural appropriation or cultural appreciation is complicated. And I'm kind of in that way. And I think there's a lot of people of color who want to appreciate Black culture, but they don't realize that, there's a history behind that, a history, and that could be taken the wrong way. And then I would say the last one that makes it complicated, and I've seen this personally just in my own community, is if you're in a relationship with a Black person and you're in love and you intend to marry this person, but you're hiding it from your family, right? Because you want to protect their honor and the family name. And immigrant communities of color really are so collectivist. We care about our families. We don't want to let our families down. We have so much community shame. And so saying, well, I'm going to, hide it from my family. And even though you're in love with that person, that's really anti-Black, right? And I think you have to really have a critical analysis to realize that. So those are some of the ways that people of color make this a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, no, thank you, Cindu. So I see, is it Kabina? I think I got this wrong last time, so I apologize in advance. Please correct me when you unmute yourself and share.
No problem, Nika. It's Kwabena.
Kwabena, thank you.
Right. Good. It's still morning. Good morning, everybody. So I'm a D&I practitioner, been in D&I for a long time, different ways. And I feel like I've always been in this D&I space because I grew up as a confused kid. And when I say confused kid, I'm Black and white. And growing up in the 70s and 80s, I wasn't Black enough to be Black, and I obviously wasn't white. So for a couple years, I used to say I was Puerto Rican. So that being said, this D&I is not a new thing. It's been around for so long. It as you talked about, Cindu, it has ebbs and flows. It changes. And one of the things, and I'm going to be very selfish, so I'm going to put that out here, selfish, biased, and in my own space. I'm curious you talk about, being allies within different cultures. And sometimes I feel, again, this is me, Robin and Marcus J. Collins, nobody else. I feel as though as Black man or mixed kid Black man, the conversation, we get lost in the conversation. And sometimes it feels like we are left out of opportunities because there's a significant push on, as a straight Black man, cisgender straight Black man. When you think about equality and equity and LGBTQ equity, there's a lot of conversations around that. And the scary Black man ends up being like, okay, we're just not going to deal with that anymore because we're now focused on making sure we have more women, or including, LGBTQ community. And so now the straight Black man is like, well, we don't really have to deal with that anymore. And because it's kind of scary dealing with them based on what society and American imagery says. So my question is, I'd like to hear you talk more about the allyship, how, women, LGBTQ, different ethnicities can help us, people like myself, change that image that is pervading our communities and our society and corporations. But
yeah, I think one of the things is what you explained, the angry Black or the scary Black man is really entrenched in our biases, our subconscious biases. And so, I never start with an implicit bias training, but there are so many unchecked anti-Black biases that we have to call out, right? And I hear you, as a Black cisgender straight male, you have these privileged identities, but you're a Black man, right? And Black men, have experienced, horrendous oppression, and we don't see enough Black men in the space of DEI work. And I think one person I would direct you to follow is Eddie Moore Jr. Eddie Moore Jr. He is been doing this work. I don't know if you know who he is. He started the White Privilege Conference, and he is just very well known. And he's a cisgendered Black man married to a white woman, and he is amazing. And he, I think that having role models that are other people like you doing this. Jamie Washington is another person that I would recommend following. And if you can LinkedIn me, message me, I'll send you their profiles. And I think they could help you navigate that. But I do think that it's so important to engage in solidarity with each other, right? So we all have privilege and simultaneously we all have oppressed identities, and to understand that there's space for all of us, right? So I hope that I helped a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much for your question. So again, I want to open up the floor to allow space maybe for others as well. Nicole, I know that you had an earlier comment into the chat, and I would like to bring that to the conversation. Are you willing to unmute yourself and share? I'll give you just a second to make that decision. And if not, I certainly will take that as no, and I'm happy just to read your commentary. Nicole Powell.
No, thank you. Yeah, she said no, thank you in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Nicole Powell says, as a person of privilege, I'd love to hear some examples of compliments that can be well received that do not land as a microaggression. She further goes on to say, I certainly don't have that intent. I find that I still want to compliment, but now shy away from it in fear of an accidental misstep. A good example might be, I love your hairstyle, and I like to tell you that just as I would anyone of culture. Is that still okay to give the genuine compliment, or is there a better way to phrase it so that the intent of a genuine compliment is received as intended?
Well, I'm not a Black woman, so I'll just give you my perspective, and then I think a Black woman should chime in. I remember I was doing a training last summer, and I was talking about microaggressions, and I gave the example of hair, right? And there's so much research and literature that documents this. And how it is just emotionally exhausting when someone's always commenting on your hair. And the white woman was so angry. She's like, well, now I'm never going to be able to even compliment hair because of you, right? And so I think the rule of thumb is if you're complimenting somebody's hair, are you complimenting everybody's hair, right? Are you always complimenting everybody's hair, or are you just complimenting Black folks' hair? And if you're only complimenting one person or one identity group's hair, then maybe you should probably refrain from that, because you're just putting a lot of attention, and there's a history of oppression around Black hair. So that's my take, but I think Nika, you should take that because you got more experience.
This is a topic that could go on for quite some time, but I first want to acknowledge, Nicole, the sentiment of being in a space to where you really are following some level of genuine curiosity and genuine appreciation for what you are seeing and experiencing. And because I know of a lot of people that are coming from that same place, and when they hear that it has created harm, they are confused. And so I want to just validate the confusion. I think that's why these types of conversations are so important. Cindu mentioned about centering whiteness and white dominance. And so as a society, we have just been conditioned to believe that whiteness is the preferred, the superior way, right? And so for Black women, and just women of color in general, but specifically Black women, we have struggled with that. I will say that as a woman that has been wearing her natural hair for 10 years now, I used to be one that got my hair pressed and relaxed and be straight because I was was conditioned by a lot of what society had said, which was that what was more professional, what was more attractive was that silky straight hair, right? And so I decided, no, I want to wear my natural hair. This is how my hair grows out of my head. I am proud of my Black heritage, and I want to own that, and I want to show up in that manner. But it does get exhausting as Black women because we do experiment with our hair a lot. We wear our hair different ways. And when people question and always want to touch and feel, it makes us feel a little, it feels intrusive. And it also feels like something is so different about us that it's like we're on display at a museum, perhaps. That's another way to think about it. And it's not something that's welcomed. And so, and I think sometimes it's about how in which the compliments are given. If it's just a simple, your hair looks nice today, you know, I mean, each person is different. I certainly don't mind that. I will simply just say thank you. But if every day, every time I encounter you, it's like, oh, your hair is different again. Oh, your hair is different again. It's like, okay, this is what we do. Is why is that so odd to you? And so I just want to give some perspective, but I really do value the fact that you brought this to the conversation, because again, your question is something that many people are sitting with and thinking about. And I'm glad that this is a podcast where we can kind of deal with these topics. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're getting almost to the top of the hour. I want to see if there are any other questions. I want to give anyone else who would like to unmute yourself and share. You have a moment to do so now. I'm seeing some things in the chat and I will certainly acknowledge them, but I want to just open up space. Okay, Andrea, go for it. We can't hear you right now.
Yeah, you can read her question. It says it's about the privilege.
Okay,
I'm very sorry for wasting everyone's time. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
All
Go
right,
for
cool.
it.
My apologies. Cindu, you are on the money. I really am enjoying your insights. I wanted you to just touch a little bit more. I may have written it wrong, but your statement, we all have privilege and we all have repressed parts of our identity. I'm a DEI consultant, and I work a lot in the workplace and with companies, and a lot of time the company's not dealing with social justice. They're just trying to get those business case issues and make it an inclusive workplace. I just want to be intentional in raising everybody's capacity to operate on a higher level. So I don't mind that being the entry point. And I think your statement might really serve as a nice aha moment for folks. So I wondered if you could share a little more and give me some nuance on that. Thank you. Thank you, Nika.
You know, in the work I do, no matter what, I always think it's important to look in the mirror. If you want to be an inclusive person, you have to examine the intersections of identity, privilege, and power. And so that's kind of the way I approach it. And, you know, there's a privilege chart or a power chart, sorry, and it has different identities. And the reality is that every society has a social hierarchy, right? Across class and race and gender and et cetera. And so if you look at all the identity categories, whether it's gender, race, age, class, ability, disability, mental capacity, all of these different things, you know, all of us will probably have some identities that are privileged, but simultaneously we have some identities that are disadvantaged, right? Just based off of the way we show up in society. So for example, you know, I am an Indian woman and I've experienced a lot of, you know, I would say racism and oppressive experiences, but at the same time, you know, my dad, by the time I was 1, had his own business, right? So economically, I've always been privileged. I have ability. And if you just look at privilege, there's so many different types of privilege. Like pregnancy privilege is something that people don't realize until you become a woman and you are in your 20s or 30s and people start having fertility issues, right? I have pregnancy privilege. I never had to worry about having a kid. It just happened, right? And so I think it's so important to think about both our dominant and our non-dominant identities and realize that not everybody, but the majority of people will have both, right? They'll have both identities that are privileged and also a society that says they're not as privileged. And we have to be empathetic of that, right? Because a lot of times we see people, even though they might look like us, we think that they have the same lived experiences, but they don't, because so much of our identities lie beneath the surface, right? We can't see them.
Thank you, Andrea, for your question. So we are almost at the top of the hour. Maybe able to squeeze in one more. If someone is really feeling emboldened to want to get your question in, this is now your chance. Unmute yourself and share. Hearing none, I will just amplify a couple of the statements that are really resonating with me. So Tina McDaniel says, I am a DEI practitioner in a dominant white community and space. Since I am new to this role, I want to ensure I don't get sidetracked by white centering, white adjacency. I appreciate the conversation on white adjacency. Thank you, Tina, for joining us today. Michael, by constantly focusing on and inspecting the characteristics of Black people, such as our hair, what they are in fact doing is constantly pointing out to us and everyone else how we are different from them, which is a total opposite of inclusive practices, all while claiming that they don't see color, of course. And so, yes, it goes back to our conversations before. Michael, really rich. Thank you for contributing that to the conversation. Well, Cindu, I want to give you the final remarks. You know, is there anything that we have not touched on today that you're feeling a lot of energy and passion around that you want to leave this community with?
No, I mean, I would say maybe a call to action, you know, and that's just the reality that, you know, being an advocate or an ally goes beyond posting on social media, right? I think there's so much performative allyship that we've seen so much, you know, since the murder of George Floyd. There's a lot of silence on social media around anti-Blackness. If you just look at hashtags, you're not seeing the same. And I think that it's so important that we go beyond, you know, talking and we start walking so that we can actually see change and we can see racial equity. And I encourage all of you, regardless of your skin color, to be in this fight. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for being here. This was so rich. And I hope that those of you who found it valuable, you will also maybe share this out, the replay, which you will receive this afternoon with others in your network. We never take it for granted when our guest co-hosts say yes to us and do. So we are so grateful. And we just appreciate you sharing. Thank you to all of you who also connect here with us today for our Intentional Conversations VodCast. We look forward to seeing you back next week at the same time as we welcome Mary Frances Winters. And so enjoy your weekend, everyone. Thank you kindly.